They're doing us like this.
What other way they ever do us?
Last night, a woman jogger was found unconscious and partially clothed in Central Park. She was beaten and sexually assaulted.
Ava DuVernay's Netflix series, When They See Us, introduces us to Corey Weiss, Raymond Santana, Yusuf Salam, Kevin Richardson, and Antron McCrae, 5 black teens falsely accused and imprisoned due to racial prejudice. Unfamiliar with the story, many people took to social media to express their outrage. They couldn't believe that the very people put in place to protect the law could manipulate it so poorly. But what most people didn't understand is that this is a very common occurrence for African Americans in the criminal justice system. While watching this story, I felt every emotion imaginable: anger, rage, hatred, sadness, fear. It's like, what can you possibly do? But the main feeling that I felt was deja vu. I'd heard this story before, I'd seen something similar to this before, and then it finally hit me. On March 25th, 1931, a fight broke out on a freight train in Jackson County, Alabama. Police arrested 9 black men, ages 13 through 19. While deputies questioned Rudy Bates and Victoria Price, they accused the 9 boys of raping them. With little to no evidence, the 9 men were still whisked away to Scottsboro, Alabama, where they would await trial. Charlie Wim, Ozzie Powell, Clarence Norris, Andrew and Leroy Wright, Olson Montgomery, Willie Roberson, Haywood Patterson, and Eugene Williams would now be known as the Scottsboro Boys. The first set of trials started April of 1931. During this time, an all-white, all-male jury convicted 8 of the 9 Scottsboro Boys to death. The only one that did not receive the death penalty was Leroy Wright because he was 13 years old. They instead opted to give him life in prison. It was around this time that the International Labor Defense, or ILD, would take on the case for the Scottsboro Boys. In November 1932, the U.S. Supreme Court would rule in Powell versus Alabama that the Scottsboro Boys did not receive the right to counsel. This violated due process under the 14th Amendment, which resulted in the conviction being overturned. The second round of trials began in Decatur, Alabama, where Rudy Bates, one of the original accusers, would recant her testimony and even agree to testify for the defense. This, along with the initial medical examination, which refuted any type of rape, was presented to the jurors. This did not matter because the all-white jury still recommended the death penalty when convicting Patterson. In January of 1935, the United States Supreme Court overturned the guilty verdict in the Norris versus Alabama case. They claimed that the exclusion of black jurors denied the rights to a fair trial to the defendants. The verdict for Norris versus Alabama resulted in a retrial for Haywood Patterson, and in early 1963, he would be convicted for a 4th time, but this time sentenced to 75 years in prison. Even after all of the appeals, the Alabama Supreme Court still upheld Patterson's conviction, and in his 3rd trial, Norris would receive the death penalty. Andrew and Charlie were both convicted of rape and given long sentences. While Powell's rape charges were dropped, he still faced 20 years for assaulting a deputy. After serving 6 years in prison for something they were falsely accused of, the remaining 4 defendants, Montgomery, Roberson, Williams, and Leroy Wright, would be released from prison. It wasn't until 2013 that the remaining 3 Scottsboro Boys received a pardon. We can compare and contrast the details in both of these horrific stories, and there's no question about it. But what we need to mainly focus on is the underlying theme, which is the way that African Americans are treated in the criminal justice system. These are just 2 stories that have been brought to light, but there are many stories of people who have been falsely accused and have spent prison times for things that they did not do. Even with all the lack of evidence, the Scottsboro Boys and the Central Park 5 were still convicted and sentenced to prison time. So you may be asking, how do I prevent this when, even when there's no proof that I did it, I could still be charged? Every circumstance is different, and there's no way for me to pinpoint and tell you exactly what you need to do to stay out of trouble or to stop from being falsely accused. But there are 2 main things that come to mind when thinking about ways to prevent this from happening to you. First and foremost, I think we need to learn our rights. There are so many laws put in place to protect us, such as the Miranda rights, the 5th and 14th Amendment, but if we don't exercise them, how can we expect them to work? Please do not get me wrong. Just because you exercise your rights does not mean they will not be violated, but being able to understand the severity of your situation and how you're being treated could go a long way. Secondly, and this really hurts to say, but we need to learn how to interact during police encounters. With the current climate of our nation, it seems like African Americans are the main target of police brutality. There was a point in time where every single time I turned on the news, I learned of another unarmed African American who had been killed. Discussing with your children and educating yourself on how to interact during a police encounter could be the difference between life and death. Please do not misunderstand me. You can do everything correctly and still be a victim of police brutality. But by understanding how to interact, you dispel any chances that they can have for excuses for why they messed up.